The city skyline glittered like a crown of diamonds, but from the top floor of the glass tower, Alexander Grant felt none of its sparkle. To the world, he was the man who had it all, a billionaire, the face of success, the king of commerce. His companies stretched across industries, his investments shaped economies, and his name commanded respect in boardrooms worldwide. Yet inside his penthouse, surrounded by silence and marble walls, he felt like the loneliest man alive. His life was a carefully crafted performance. By day, he wore the armor of confidence, custom suits, rehearsed smiles, a commanding voice that silenced critics and inspired shareholders. Cameras flashed when he entered events, journalists praised his vision, and social media painted him as untouchable. But once the lights dimmed, when the world's eyes turned elsewhere, Alexander returned to himself, a man plagued by an emptiness he couldn't explain. He thought wealth would fill the void. As a boy growing up in a broken household, he dreamed of power and riches as the key to safety and happiness. He swore he'd never again taste poverty, humiliation, or helplessness. And he succeeded, more than anyone could have imagined. But now, at 50, sitting alone in his penthouse, he realized the empire he built had become a prison. The walls were decorated with masterpieces, paintings worth millions, but they meant nothing to him. His dining table could seat 20, yet no one ever joined him. His phone buzzed endlessly with calls, but none came from family or true friends, only from lawyers, investors, and opportunists. Even his marriage, once a promise of companionship, had crumbled years ago. His wife left when she realized that love could not compete with his obsession for wealth. His only son, Daniel, spoke to him rarely, their conversations reduced to cold exchanges about money and inheritance. Alexander was feared, envied, admired, but never loved. That night, as he stared at his reflection in the vast windows of his penthouse, he wondered how everything had gone so wrong. He had climbed higher than anyone, but in the process, had lost the ground beneath his feet. The applause of the world echoed around him, but it felt hollow. He poured himself a glass of aged whiskey, swirling it slowly. Outside, the city pulsed with life. Couples laughed on sidewalks, music spilled from cafes, and strangers hugged in the warmth of ordinary connection. For the first time in years, Alexander envied them. Not their possessions, but their joy, their bonds, their freedom to love without suspicion. His chest felt heavy, not from the alcohol, but from the weight of realization. He was the man who had everything, yet in truth, he had nothing. And though the world celebrated him as a titan, inside, Alexander was crumbling. Tomorrow, he would put the mask back on. Tomorrow, he would smile for cameras and sign deals worth billions. But tonight, in the silence of his empire, the billionaire whispered to himself words he never dared admit out loud. "I am the poorest rich man alive." The night was restless. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner of Alexander's penthouse seemed louder than usual, echoing in the stillness like a countdown. He had tried to drown the emptiness with whiskey, but it only deepened the ache in his chest. As he loosened his tie and sat on the edge of his bed, the city lights outside flickered like distant stars, mocking his solitude. He rubbed his temples, feeling an unusual pressure in his chest. It started as a faint tightness, something he thought he could ignore. But within minutes, it grew into a suffocating weight pressing down on him. The glass slipped from his hand, shattering on the marble floor, amber liquid spreading like a stain of weakness he couldn't hide. For the first time in decades, fear gripped him, not fear of losing money, reputation, or power, but fear of losing his very life. His breaths came short and sharp. He staggered to the window, pressing his palms against the cool glass as though it could steady him. The city beneath him blurred through his vision, and sweat beaded on his forehead. "Help!" he whispered, though no one was there to hear. The irony was cruel. He was the man who had everything, doctors on call, security at his disposal, staff ready to serve. But in this moment of crisis, he was utterly alone. His phone was just a few feet away on the nightstand, but even reaching for it felt impossible. His knees buckled, and he collapsed onto the floor, clutching his chest. The silence of the penthouse was unbearable. For the first time, Alexander realized how fragile he truly was. All the billions, the power, the admiration, none of it could shield him from the simple truth that he was human, vulnerable, and breakable. A cry escaped his lips, louder this time, raw and desperate. "Please, someone, help me!" The sound startled even him. He had never begged in his life, never allowed himself to appear weak before anyone. Yet here he was, pleading into the emptiness, his voice cracking with terror. Through the haze of pain, his mind replayed the faces of those he had pushed away. His ex-wife, his distant son, the friends who had once cared but drifted when they realized Alexander only had room for business in his life. If this was the end, he thought bitterly, he would die the same way he lived, alone in a fortress of wealth. But fate had a different plan. Outside, in the alley beside his tower, a ragged figure stirred. The man was invisible to most, just another homeless beggar in the city, wrapped in torn blankets, his back against a dumpster. His name was Samuel, though the world rarely bothered to ask. Nights were long and cold for him, and hunger gnawed at his belly. But on this night, through the stillness of the city, he heard it, a faint, broken cry carried down from the heights above. Samuel lifted his head, squinting at the skyscraper. To anyone else, it would have sounded like the wind, but he recognized desperation when he heard it. After all, he had lived with desperation his whole life. Up there, in the golden cage of glass, a billionaire was crying out. And down here in the gutter, a beggar was about to answer. Samuel pulled himself up from the cold pavement, his joints stiff from the night's chill. The muffled cry still echoed faintly in his ears. He tilted his head, scanning the glittering skyscraper above him. People in towers like that didn't cry for help, at least, not where beggars could hear them. But Samuel had learned to trust his instincts. Survival demanded it. He tightened the frayed blanket around his shoulders and shuffled closer to the building. Security guards usually shooed him away long before he reached the lobby, but tonight the front doors stood oddly unguarded. Through the gleaming glass, he could see a deserted reception desk. Strange, he thought, his curiosity outweighing the familiar sting of humiliation. Most nights, he kept his head down to avoid trouble, but something about that cry wouldn't let him walk away. It wasn't just a sound, it was the raw, broken plea of a man on the edge. Samuel had been there more times than he cared to count. Inside, the marble floors gleamed like mirrors, reflecting a world Samuel didn't belong to. His torn shoes squeaked against the surface as he made his way to the elevator. To his surprise, no one stopped him. Perhaps fate, or something greater, was holding the doors open. When the elevator chimed on the top floor, Samuel hesitated. His reflection stared back at him from the golden doors, a gaunt face, eyes sunken from years of hardship, hair unkempt. "What am I doing here?" he wondered. "This isn't my world." Yet the cry still echoed in his memory, pushing him forward. The penthouse doors loomed ahead. They were ajar, a sliver of darkness spilling into the brightly lit hallway. Samuel pushed them open and stepped inside. The sight stopped him cold. On the floor, sprawled beside a shattered glass and a half-empty bottle of whiskey, was Alexander Knight, the billionaire whose face had been plastered across newspapers, magazines, and television screens for years. To Samuel, he had always seemed untouchable, a man of marble and iron. But here he was, clutching his chest, gasping for breath like a drowning man. "Help!" Alexander rasped, his eyes widening in shock at the stranger before him. Samuel dropped his blanket and rushed to his side. Years of scraping by on the streets had given him more knowledge of emergencies than he realized. When you live among the forgotten, you become your own doctor, nurse, and savior. "Stay with me," Samuel urged, checking Alexander's breathing. "You're not done yet." His voice was steady, though inside his heart pounded. With trembling hands, Samuel elevated Alexander's head, loosening the suffocating tie around his neck. He urged him to take slow breaths, coaching him through the panic. The billionaire's eyes locked on Samuel's, one pair filled with desperation, the other with determination. "Why are you helping me?" Alexander croaked between breaths. Samuel managed a faint smile, though it carried years of weariness. "Because no one else is here." For a moment, time stood still. Two men from opposite worlds, a beggar and a billionaire, were bound together not by wealth or power, but by the fragile thread of humanity. In that instant, the titles melted away. One was not a billionaire, the other not a beggar. They were simply two men, one fighting to live, and the other fighting to save. And as Samuel steadied Alexander through the darkness of the night, neither of them knew that this unlikely meeting would change both of their lives forever. The faint morning light crept into the penthouse through floor-to-ceiling windows. Samuel sat slouched in a leather chair, his ragged blanket wrapped around him, his eyes red from exhaustion. On the sofa across from him lay Alexander Knight, billionaire tycoon, now awake but still pale, his breathing steady after the night's ordeal. For a while, silence filled the room, broken only by the hum of the city below. Alexander studied the man who had saved him, his sharp eyes narrowing in confusion. The figure before him didn't belong in his immaculate world: dirty clothes, calloused hands, the smell of the streets clinging to him. And yet, there was a quiet strength in Samuel's posture, something Alexander couldn't ignore. "You," Alexander finally said, his voice hoarse but stern. "Who are you? How did you get in here?" Samuel glanced up, unshaken. "Name's Samuel. I heard you crying out, thought someone needed help." Alexander frowned, his pride stung. Billionaires weren't supposed to be found broken and vulnerable, least of all by a beggar. "You shouldn't be here. This place isn't for—" He stopped himself before finishing the thought, but the insult lingered between them. Samuel rose slowly, the blanket slipping from his shoulders. "You're right," he said, his voice calm yet edged with weariness. "I don't belong in places like this. But last night, you didn't belong in pain either. We're both out of place, I guess." The words struck Alexander harder than he expected. He had built his empire on the idea of control over markets, over people, over himself. Yet in his darkest hour, it was a man with nothing who had given him the one thing he couldn't buy: compassion. "I owe you," Alexander admitted reluctantly, his pride resisting every syllable. "Whatever you want, I can give it. Money, food, clothes, name it." Samuel chuckled bitterly. "If money fixed everything, you wouldn't have been crying last night." The billionaire stiffened. It was the first time in years someone had spoken to him so directly, without fear or flattery. His instinct was to snap back, to put the man in his place. But instead, he leaned back into the cushions, unsettled by the truth in Samuel's words. "You think you understand me?" Alexander said coldly. "No," Samuel replied. "But I understand pain. I understand losing things you can't get back. I've lived on the streets long enough to know what emptiness feels like. Maybe that's something you understand too." For the first time, Alexander looked away. The steel in his gaze softened, revealing cracks in the mask he wore so carefully. His wealth, his power, none of it had shielded him from loneliness, guilt, or despair. Samuel walked toward the door. "I'll leave now. You don't need me here." "Wait," Alexander called out, his voice low but firm. Samuel stopped, hand on the handle. "Stay. Just for a while. I don't know why, but I feel like you have something to teach me." Samuel turned, studying the billionaire whose empire could buy the world but not peace of mind. A faint smile crossed his lips. "Maybe. But only if you're willing to listen." And in that fragile moment, the walls between two worlds, the glittering world of wealth and the forgotten world of poverty, began to crumble. The next morning, Alexander Knight found himself in an unfamiliar position, sitting across from Samuel, not as a savior or benefactor, but as a listener. His world of boardrooms and billion-dollar deals suddenly felt inadequate against the raw honesty of the man who had pulled him from despair. Samuel sat at the edge of his chair, sipping coffee from a porcelain cup that looked awkward in his rough hands. "You know," he began, his tone steady, "life on the streets teaches you things no school ever will. Things you can't learn with money in your pocket." Alexander raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" "Survival." Samuel shook his head. "Perspective. Out there, every day's a battle. Not just for food or shelter, but for dignity. You see people at their worst, and their best. You learn to recognize kindness in small gestures, because it might be the only kindness you get." The billionaire leaned back, arms crossed. "And you think I've never known struggle?" Samuel met his eyes firmly. "Maybe you have. But money shields you from the raw edges of it. Struggle without safety nets, that's different. You cry, you bleed, and the world walks past you like you don't exist. That's the kind of pain you can't cover up with wealth." The words stung. Alexander had spent years burying his loneliness beneath success, pretending his empire made him untouchable. But here was a man who had nothing, stripping away his illusions with simple truths. "You're saying I don't understand real pain?" Alexander challenged. "I'm saying you've forgotten what it feels like," Samuel replied softly. Your money can buy silence, distractions, and company, but it can't fill the emptiness inside. That's why you cried last night, isn't it? Not because of business or losses, but because you're alone. Alexander froze. The truth hung heavy between them. No amount of denial could erase it. Samuel continued, his voice calmer now. Out on the streets, we survive by looking out for each other. We share scraps of food, cover each other in the cold, tell stories to make the night feel shorter. We've got nothing, but sometimes, nothing makes us see everything clearly. For the first time in years, Alexander felt something stir within him. Shame, perhaps, or humility. His wealth had insulated him so completely that he'd forgotten the humanity of those below him. You sound like you're proud of being homeless, Alexander said quietly. Samuel chuckled, shaking his head. There's nothing proud about it. It's hard, it's ugly. But it teaches you what matters. People, moments, the little things you can't buy. And maybe, that's what you've been missing. Silence stretched between them, not heavy this time, but thoughtful. Alexander tapped his fingers on the armrest, his mind racing. For the first time, he wondered if all his success had blinded him to life's simplest truths. Finally, he asked, what would you teach me if I were willing to learn? Samuel leaned forward, his eyes steady. Start small. Step outside your world and see mine. Let yourself feel things without trying to buy your way out of them. That's the first lesson. And in that moment, Alexander, billionaire, mogul, untouchable, nodded. For the first time, he felt like a student. The evening air was sharp, carrying the scent of damp asphalt and smoke from distant food carts. Alexander Knight had never walked these streets without tinted car windows between him and reality. Tonight, guided by Samuel, he stepped into a world that pulsed with shadows and whispers. Keep your hands in your pockets, Samuel advised. Not because anyone will steal from you, but because it'll make you look less out of place. Alexander smirked faintly. I doubt there's any way I'll blend in here. Samuel gave him a sidelong glance. Maybe not. But blending in isn't the point. Feeling it is. They walked past rows of crumbling buildings, their bricks darkened by years of neglect. People huddled in doorways, wrapped in blankets too thin to fight the chill. A woman clutched a cardboard sign with trembling hands, while a man rummaged through an overflowing trash bin. Alexander's polished shoes clicked against the pavement, an almost offensive sound amid the silence of desperation. He felt eyes on him, tired, hollow eyes that judged and measured. Not with envy, but with disbelief. He didn't belong here, and he knew it. Samuel stopped near a burned-out storefront where a group of men sat around a small fire in a metal barrel. Evening, brothers, Samuel greeted. One of the men, his face weathered and scarred, looked up. Samuel. Brought a friend, I see. Alexander shifted uneasily, but Samuel gestured for him to sit on an overturned crate. The billionaire hesitated before lowering himself, his tailored coat brushing against rust and dirt. The men spoke in hushed tones, sharing stories of the day, how one found half a sandwich behind a diner, how another had been chased away by security guards while trying to sleep near a bank's warm air vent. Alexander listened, each tale striking him harder than any business failure he had ever endured. Why don't they just get jobs? Alexander finally asked, the words escaping before he could stop himself. The scarred man laughed bitterly. Jobs? You think anyone's hiring folks who don't have an address, who can't shower, who wear the same clothes every day? We're invisible to your world. The answer silenced Alexander. He thought of the endless resumes his companies ignored, the countless faces turned away at the first sign of imperfection. He had been blind. Samuel leaned closer. Now you see. Out here, survival is a job. Every breath is earned. As the night deepened, the fire dimmed, and Alexander shivered in the cold. His coat, though expensive, seemed useless against the icy wind. He glanced at Samuel, who only tightened his ragged jacket and smiled faintly, used to discomfort. Walking back later, Alexander couldn't shake the images. The children sleeping under bridges, the old man coughing in the shadows, the silent stares of people who had nothing yet still endured. Why did you bring me here? Alexander asked quietly. Samuel's voice was steady. Because money makes walls around people. Tonight, I showed you the cracks. If you want to learn, you have to walk through the shadows first. For the first time, Alexander felt those walls crumbling inside him. And though the night was dark, something in him began to awaken. The next morning, Alexander sat in his penthouse office, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a sweeping view of the city skyline. The sun glinted off steel towers, but to him, the view felt hollow. The polished surface of his desk reflected his tired eyes, and the silence of the room pressed against him like a weight. He could still hear the voices from last night, the laughter around the barrel fire, the bitter reply of the scarred man, Samuel's calm wisdom. The images of those who lived in the shadows haunted him far more than the ghosts of any business deal gone wrong. For the first time, Alexander wondered if he was the prisoner, not of poverty, but of wealth. His phone buzzed with reminders of meetings, expansion deals, merger opportunities, an investors' gala. He should have been excited. These were the things he lived for. But now they felt like chains, golden, gleaming, and suffocating. Samuel's words rang in his ears. Money makes walls around people. When his assistant walked in with a stack of reports, Alexander raised a hand. Cancel everything today, he said. The assistant blinked. Sir? But you have. Cancel it, Alexander repeated, his voice firm. Left alone, he stood and paced. The floor beneath him was polished marble, yet he felt as though he were walking on brittle glass. He thought of his employees. How many of them lived paycheck to paycheck while he sat on billions? He thought of the people outside his corporate doors who never even had a chance to step inside. Suddenly, he grabbed a notepad and began scribbling. Housing projects, street-to-work initiatives, healthcare for the homeless. The ideas poured out, wild and unstructured, but urgent. A knock interrupted him. It was Samuel. How did you get up here? Alexander asked, surprised. Samuel smiled faintly. Doors open when they're meant to. Alexander chuckled. You always speak like that. I speak what I see, Samuel replied. His eyes scanned the desk, landing on the notes. You're ready. Ready for what? To break your chains. Alexander sank into his chair. I don't even know where to begin. I've built my empire on profit margins and power plays. If I start dismantling that, what happens to me? Samuel stepped closer. Then you stop being a prisoner. You stop living for yourself and start living for others. Chains don't break easily, Alexander. They shatter when you decide you're strong enough to pull. The billionaire stared at the man who had once begged on his sidewalks, and something inside him shifted. He wasn't sure if it was courage, guilt, or desperation, but he knew Samuel was right. He picked up the phone, dialed his board chairman, and said words he never thought he'd say. We're changing everything. Effective immediately. I want our resources redirected. No more empty skyscrapers while people freeze outside them. If the board doesn't like it, they can leave. Samuel's smile deepened, but his tone stayed steady. You've taken the first step. Alexander leaned back, exhaling. The chains weren't gone yet, but for the first time, he felt them loosen. The announcement spread through Alexander's company like wildfire. Board members were furious, investors panicked, and business journalists sharpened their pens, eager to declare his downfall. To the outside world, the billionaire had lost his mind. But to Alexander, it felt like the first breath of fresh air he'd taken in years. Still, change never came without resistance. That afternoon, he faced the boardroom. A dozen pairs of eyes glared at him across a polished oak table, the tension thick enough to choke. Alexander, barked Mr. Harrington, the oldest board member, his silver hair gleaming under the lights. You can't just redirect billions from our projects into charity. He spat the word as though it were poison. Do you realize what that will do to our shareholders? Yes, Alexander replied evenly. I know exactly what it will do. And I don't care. The room erupted in protests, voices overlapping like a storm. Alexander raised his hand, silencing them. Listen to me. For years, we've built towers of glass and steel, while people starve outside their shadows. What good is our success if the city around us crumbles? If you can't see that, then maybe you shouldn't be sitting at this table. Silence followed, broken only by the nervous shuffle of papers. Some members looked away, others clenched their jaws. Alexander could feel their hatred, their fear, but also from a few, the faint flicker of curiosity. Seeds, he thought. Tiny seeds in hardened soil. Later that evening, he met Samuel in the quiet of a small cafe far from the glittering towers. The homeless man sat across from him, sipping coffee slowly as though it were a luxury. "You spoke today," Samuel said softly. "And they heard you." "They didn't like what they heard," Alexander muttered. "Some of them will try to destroy me." "Good," Samuel replied with a smile. "If no one resists, then you've changed nothing." Alexander stared at him. "Do you really think I can do this? Transform a company, maybe even a city?" Samuel leaned forward, his voice low but steady. "You're not planting trees, Alexander. You're planting forests. But forests don't grow overnight. The question is, can you water them when the drought comes?" The words settled into Alexander's chest like a challenge. He nodded slowly. The next week, his company launched its first initiative, converting an abandoned warehouse into temporary housing for families in need. The media mocked him at first, calling it a publicity stunt. But when cameras caught Alexander himself, sleeves rolled up, helping paint the walls, the narrative began to shift. Some employees followed his lead, volunteering after hours. A few even admitted they had once hidden their own struggles with poverty. For the first time, Alexander felt his empire wasn't just about profit, it was about people. And yet, as the seeds of change sprouted, darker whispers began to stir. Rivals circled like wolves, waiting for his vision to collapse. The board plotted behind closed doors. But Alexander stood firm. He had made his choice. And with Samuel by his side, he would see it through. The morning headlines were brutal. Billionaire turns company into charity machine, investors furious. Alexander crosses the line, empire on the brink of collapse. Alexander sat in his office, the newspaper spread before him like a verdict. He had known it wouldn't be easy, but the storm had come faster than expected. His phone buzzed relentlessly, calls from lawyers, messages from investors, warnings from allies. And then, the final blow, a petition from the board to strip him of his authority. Samuel arrived at his office quietly, a calm presence amid the chaos. He took one look at Alexander's pale face and said, "They've come for you, haven't they?" "Yes," Alexander whispered, his voice heavy. "They're ready to tear me down. All because I dared to care." He slammed the paper shut, anger flashing in his eyes. "Maybe I was a fool. Maybe I should have kept quiet, played the game." Samuel leaned against the window, his rough hands folded in front of him. "If you wanted comfort, you wouldn't have started this. You said you wanted change. Did you think change would come without a cost?" Alexander fell silent, staring at the city skyline outside. The towers glistened like cold giants, indifferent to the lives in their shadows. That evening, the board convened. The room was hostile from the moment Alexander walked in. The chairman, Harrington, wasted no time. "You've lost us millions," he thundered. "Shareholders are leaving in droves. Your recklessness threatens everything we've built. We demand your resignation, effective immediately." Gasps echoed around the table. Alexander felt his chest tighten, but he forced himself to stand tall. "You built towers," he said, his voice steady though his heart raced. "I'm trying to build something that lasts longer than steel and glass. People. Hope. Humanity. If that makes me unfit, then perhaps I was never fit to lead this company." The vote was swift. Hands raised against him, one after another, until the count was undeniable. Alexander Cross was out. The news broke within the hour. Media outlets gloated, rivals celebrated, and the city buzzed with rumors of his downfall. Alone in his penthouse, Alexander stared at the floor, a hollow ache in his chest. He had lost everything, his power, his company, his name. Samuel found him there, slumped in the dark. He pulled up a chair and sat silently for a long time before finally speaking. "This is the test," Samuel said gently. "When everything is stripped away, your wealth, your influence, your pride, what remains? That's who you are." Tears burned Alexander's eyes, but he didn't look away. "What if I've failed? What if I've lost it all for nothing? Samuel reached out, placing a weathered hand on his shoulder. Then you stand up. You keep walking. Because faith isn't proven when the sun shines, Alexander. Faith is proven in the storm. Alexander closed his eyes, inhaling deeply. Broken but not defeated, he realized that this was not the end. It was only the beginning. The days that followed Alexander's downfall were some of the hardest of his life. The headlines that once praised him now mocked his name. His penthouse grew colder, emptier with each passing night, and for the first time, Alexander truly understood what it meant to be powerless. But Samuel never left his side. Instead of drowning in bitterness, the old beggar urged Alexander to walk the streets with him. At first, it felt humiliating. Alexander Cross, the man who once commanded skyscrapers, now walking alleys and soup kitchens. But soon, humiliation gave way to something else: clarity. He met mothers clutching children they could barely feed. He shook hands with men who had lost everything but still smiled at strangers. He listened to voices that were ignored, cries that echoed louder than his own downfall. One night, as they sat near the river where the homeless often gathered, Samuel spoke softly. "This is what I meant when I said you'd forgotten how to live. Life isn't about sitting at the top of a tower. It's about being here, among people, among pain, among hope." For the first time, Alexander didn't argue. He simply nodded. In the weeks ahead, he began using what little power and influence he had left, not for profit, not for prestige, but for purpose. He invested his remaining savings into small shelters. He opened kitchens where the hungry could eat. He worked with volunteers, sometimes carrying boxes himself, sweat staining the shirt of a man once too proud to lift a finger. At first, the media sneered. "The fallen billionaire playing saint," they wrote. But slowly, the narrative began to change. People who had once hated him now began to see something genuine. Photos of Alexander sitting cross-legged with children in shelters, or serving food at soup lines, began to circulate. And with them came a new name: the redeemed billionaire. But the greatest redemption came not from the cameras, nor the applause. It came from within. For the first time in his life, Alexander Cross felt peace. Months later, he stood on a small stage at the opening of a community center built on land he once intended for a luxury hotel. The crowd was not dressed in suits or gowns. They were ordinary men, women, and children whose lives had been touched by his work. Alexander cleared his throat, his voice trembling with sincerity. "I lost everything," he said, pausing to let the words sink in. "But in losing it, I found something I never had before: myself. And I couldn't have done it without the man who reminded me what it means to be human." He gestured to Samuel, who stood at the edge of the stage, humble as ever. The crowd erupted in applause, and Samuel simply bowed his head, a quiet smile playing on his lips. Later, as the two of them walked away from the cheers, Alexander turned to him. "You saved me, Samuel. Not just from myself, but from the emptiness I called life." Samuel chuckled. "No, my boy. You saved yourself. I just showed you the way." And under the fading sunset, the billionaire and the beggar walked side by side, not as master and guide, not as rich and poor, but as equals. At last, Alexander Cross was free.